Given the current government debt crisis, the government is now moving uh, from taking on new debts, which it still does, by the way, but shifting the focus increasingly towards austerity and fiscal consolidation. That is what creates the consolidation state. The politics of the consolidation state in the EU runs along the following lines. The markets should be first, the markets should be spared from the cost of rescuing insolvent states, like Greece or Ireland. Instead, ordinary citizens have to foot the bill with higher taxes and fewer government services. Therefore, debt service comes before the provision of public services. That, as we might know, has been the central logic that has been applied certainly in many of the European crisis countries. Second, ailing banks should not be nationalized, but rescued with public funds from governments and central banks. Third, insolvent states have to be prevented from unilaterally declaring bankruptcy and or rescheduling debt. Fourth, if the evaluation of debt is necessary, which means, just canceling the debt jubilee kind of, this has to be done gently and over the long term, so big investors have the opportunity and time to hedge against it. This is also referred to as financial repression, or which is basically a high inflation and low interest rate policy, which eventually becomes a negative real interest rate, which means that the debts are going to be chipped away over time, and which serves as an expropriation of savers. And then another component, besides the negative real interest rate, is to require banks to purchase government bonds, so you have a captive audience. Well, the clear pattern that emerges here from these 4 points that I mentioned is that the state priority is to protect the interests of what Streeck called the Marktvolk, or the people of the market, and hurt the interests of what he called the Staatsvolk, which is the general citizenry. The power of the Marktvolk is generated from the transnational origin. They are bound by no nation state and can attack currencies and alter government bond interest rates of countries with the push of a button, implying that governments are restraining the fiscal decisions by the discipline of the market. The power also derives from the legal claims that they have over the state debt. The political power of the financial markets is in part reflected by the fact that many leading European officials are handpicked from Goldman Sachs. Lucas Papademos, who is the Greek Prime Minister, Mario Monti, former Italian Prime Minister, and Mario Draghi, the head of the ECB. The citizenry, however, is bound to the nation state and can be punished with higher taxes. They can't run away. And so that's what the government does. Periodic elections have the capacity to hold leaders accountable, as we might be able to see with the recent Greek parliamentary elections, or as it's announced, where anti-austerity and leftist Syriza party is poised to make huge gains. Of course, sending jitters across the financial markets, not surprisingly. They technically have control over politics via public opinion and pay taxes to keep the government going. Well, in that case, state leaders are put into a dilemma because, to quote Streeck, democratic debt states must maneuver between the two categories of stakeholders, keeping them both at least sufficiently happy that they do not withdraw the loyalty or their confidence. But the Staatsvolk eventually is losing out, the citizens, because democratic organization and participation has been declining, as is reflected in the lower voting turnout and in the decline of labor unions. The irony of all of this is that even as governments give capitalists and investors all that they asked for, which includes weakened organized labor, low inflation, cuts in the welfare state, increase in public debt to subsidize capitalists, high unemployment, which lowers labor wage demands, deregulation, especially in the financial sector, and privatization, which opens up profitable investment opportunities for the private sector, resulting all in restored and increased levels of profitability for the private sector. These measures have done nothing to restore economic growth and the vitality of the capitalist system. The original legitimation crisis, resulting from restive organized labor and interventionist state governments, was replaced by a new legitimation crisis enforced by the European Union, resulting from austerity and restriction in effective demand. Right? If there is no investment spending from the government, and if the people don't go out consuming, then this leads to lower sales, lower rates of profit, and to economic problems. Ironically, the road to EU monetary integration has been paved by an initial commitment to economic liberalization, as is staked out by Friedrich Hayek, an important economic philosopher. Hayek had argued that the creation of a transnational federation, which in this case is the EU, inevitably leads to more liberalization, because many regulating functions that take place on a national level cannot be transferred to the federation level, because there's a weaker sense of solidarity among federation members than among fellow countrymen. As the monetary policy is shifted to the federation, independent national central banks will cease to exist, or at least will lose their function, which is exactly what the European Central Bank is doing to the various national central banks in Europe. Nation-state level regulation to protect workers or businesses is hindered by competition with other federation countries, which is inherent in the federation. High national taxes will result in capital flight, so national governments will also refrain from this option. And we definitely see that with the tax competition we have with Luxembourg and Ireland, which are the low tax countries in the EU. Streeck finds that expanding markets and restricting democratic rights is precisely what the EU policy has been all about. In other words, he thinks that Hayek's prediction about federalism, federation, leading to liberalization, that is to say, less restrictions on firms, less labor regulations, lower taxes, etc., etc. That has been a key pillar of European Union policy. I quote, "The EU thus became a machine for the liberalization of European capitalism, enabling and sometimes compelling governments to impose any manner of pro-market reforms against the resistance of the citizens." Unquote. The common currency binds the hands of national governments and forces them down the path of liberalization and internal devaluation, i.e. wage cuts, social service cuts, and more flexible labor markets. Those demands become the most acute during economic crises, when rising budget deficits lend more credence to EU officials who want structural reforms. That is to say, deregulation, liberalization, and less employment protection for workers again. Streeck leaves no doubt about the outcome and the goals of the capitalists, and I quote again, "All that capital still wants from people is that they give back to the market, perhaps not all at once, but certainly step by step and not too slowly either, the social and civil rights they fought for and won in historic struggles. In the early 21st century, capital is confident of being able to organize itself as it pleases in a deregulated finance industry. The only thing it expects of politics is its capitulation to the market by eliminating social democracy as an economic force." Unquote. Streeck thus advocates destructive opposition, since there is no other choice in his view. The regular methods of public opinion and voting in elections have not been capable of reversing neoliberal policies, since both center-left and center-right governments, which had been in charge over the last decades, essentially carried out the same economic policies. He does not specify what destructive opposition and what he also called committing to irrational acts actually entails. Are these street protests, petitions, or riots? There's certainly a big sociological literature that we have about protests and activist movements and social revolutions, but that is of no concern to the capitalism scholar, which is Streeck. But what Streeck does talk about is the importance of scholars and intellectuals like himself to point out the absurdity of the system and make the public and policymakers understand that, quote, "the first obligation of democracies is to their own citizens," unquote, and that the state can dissolve debt contracts, which is in effect what he advocates. But where do we go from here? So there's three more ideas which Streeck touches upon towards the end of the book. Number one, we need more democracy in Europe. Well, I found Streeck to be really vague in his proposal, but what he probably meant was a return to more influence and power to the individual nation states that want to figure out what kind of economic policy suits them the best, rather than the one-size-fits-all liberalization regime which had been so socially disruptive. The second proposal is more concrete here. He talks about the potential for currency devaluation. One concrete proposal of more national sovereignty is this idea to allow the Eurozone countries to abandon the euro and return to the old currency to allow a monetary policy that fits the interests of their own country. That would be a real alternative to internal devaluation and austerity policies, but might contain other risks like higher costs in cross-national trade. Even in the pre-euro era, many governments believed that there had to be some kind of monetary order, which after the end of the Bretton Woods system was the European Monetary Union, which was a currency peg of European currencies to the German D-mark. Though I agree with Streeck that devaluation beats current policies, it is questionable whether it is the best of all options. He finally concludes on a proposal for European Bretton Woods, a new kind of Bretton Woods. Streeck wants a restoration of the Bretton Woods fixed but adjustable exchange rate system, but without US dollar backing in this case, which provides some financial stability, but giving each country ample freedom to change the currency within bands according to their needs. This seems to be a stronger framework, and it can address some of the problems I addressed previously. And there have indeed been, some experiments in that.